Hey guys, just gonna start our notes here and finish our notes on how humans are impacting the environment. This is a section of our ecology unit. This will be the very last set of notes that we're doing. So last video that we're gonna do. So this is gonna focus on environmental issues. And we're going to go through sort of a variety of those issues, and we'll talk about some of the causes of those problems, some of the potential solutions, and how they are actually impacting the environment. So the first thing to consider is why is it? So humans have a huge impact on the environment, and so the question is why? Why do humans have such a large impact? And you could sort of trace that back to sort of two big factors. The first is that humans have an ability to alter our environment to a greater extent than any other organism. Lots of organisms do affect their environment, alter their environment, and some in pretty significant ways, but none so much as humans. Humans can take one ecosystem and basically transform it into another. Imagine like Las Vegas, an area which is in the middle of the desert, extreme temperatures, extremely dry conditions. However, humans are able to alter that environment into a huge growing city that supports millions of people. Okay? And so those changes that we're able to make in the environment have some negative impacts. The other important reason is that there's a huge number of humans, and our population growth and our resource use is of prime importance here. So you could sort of trace back all of these human impacts to the sheer number of individuals living on the earth, humans living on the earth, and the resources that they use. Humans didn't always have such a large impact on the earth, but as our numbers have grown to what they are today, then those impacts have been felt very strongly. The earth's population has been growing basically exponentially. Okay? And we'll talk about why here in a minute. And the more individuals that live on the earth, they require energy and food and living space, and they desire things like cars and iPhones and all sorts of material goods that we depend upon our earth to provide the resources for. The problem is that the capacity for the earth to support our population is limited. And so if our population reaches the carrying capacity of our planet and the population cannot be supported, that is what can lead to increases in disease and famine and war and other negative impacts. If we look at the world population in this graph, we can sort of see what's happened. Since sort of the dawn of agriculture, about 10,000 years or so ago, the population on Earth was relatively low and stayed relatively low. Okay, grew gradually. But then if you look at human population after we've reached sort of modern times, okay, look at what has happened to the population of humans on Earth. Okay, it has, we're now headed up to 8 billion. It grew exponentially at an enormous rate. And the reason for that has to do with healthcare, with antibiotics, with vaccines, with sanitary knowledge of sanitary practices. All of these things have allowed humans to live longer, allowed for the expansion of the human population to these huge levels. And so as we add more humans to the earth, they require resources. When we talk about resources, we're talking about things that we depend on the earth for. Okay, could be things like food, water, fuels, etc. And we sort of classify natural resources into two broad categories. Some resources are what we call renewable sources of energy. These are sources of energy, or these are materials that are replaced over time. Okay, they don't get used up. Things like wind. Okay, the wind is not used up when you put up a wind turbine, right? The wind is going to blow the next day and the next day. Okay, the wind turbine spinning doesn't take the wind away. Solar energy is renewable. Water is renewable. We learned about the water cycle. Water is constantly recycled in an ecosystem. Food is a renewable resource, can be grown, season after season. Non-renewable resources are those resources that are not replaced over time. Things like fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas. When we extract those materials from the earth, they're not going to be replaced. They're basically used up. Minerals, metals are examples of non-renewable resources. So let's just talk about a couple examples. So this wind turbine farm here. Last weekend I went hiking. It was out near the southern Adirondacks, and I came across this ridge. It looked a lot like this, where there was a series of these wind turbines. They're usually on the ridges, and you could see them in our area because it's fairly windy here. We have a good region for wind power. And so these wind turbines, as the blades spin, they spin a turbine which generates electricity. So these wind turbines are adding electricity to the grid. And this is a renewable resource. It's not producing any pollution. Okay, that's just the mechanical motion of those turbines can be used to generate electricity. Hydropower is another renewable source of energy. Hydropower is when dams are built and to hold back water. And as water is allowed to go through the dam, that water turns a turbine, which again generates electricity. Anytime you have some spinning physical movement, you can use that to generate electricity. And so this hydropower is renewable. Okay, the water is recycled within the ecosystem. This is a renewable resource. Again, doesn't add pollution to the environment. Solar panels, photovoltaic cells, which you see more and more frequently. These take energy from the sun and transform it into electricity. Okay. Again, you're not using up sunlight by putting solar panels on your house. Geothermal energy uses energy from within the earth, okay, for energy production or for heating homes and so forth. The non-renewable resources, like we said earlier, are the things that are basically used up when you extract them and use them. And the fossil fuels that we're familiar with are all non-renewable resources. When you mine coal out of the ground and burn it, well, that coal gets used up. It's extracted. It's gone. Okay? It's transformed into carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and water, and it's not going to be coming back. Oil from within the earth is non-renewable. Natural gas that's trapped in deposits within the earth, non-renewable. And so these materials, besides the fact that they're non-renewable and they're going to be used up eventually, they also release pollution when they're burned. So using coal or natural gas or oil to produce electricity or to power equipment also has the negative effect of adding pollution to the environment. And so we'll talk about some of these environmental issues, about why species are becoming extinct in water, air pollution, changes to our atmosphere. So species extinction is extremely important. So you've heard of species becoming extinct before. You may think about the dinosaurs becoming extinct when a meteor hit the Yucatan Peninsula. And there have been mass extinctions in the past, in the history of the Earth, where a large percentage of species became extinct. However, humans are causing another great mass extinction currently. Okay, over 1 million species currently face the threat of extinction due to human impacts. And there's lots of reasons why humans would cause a species to become extinct. And some of those causes are things like overhunting, sometimes called direct harvesting. For example, passenger pigeons was a type of bird that was extremely abundant in North America, and they were hunted so much for sport that they eventually became extinct. Okay, elephants are in danger of becoming extinct because they're hunted for ivory from their tusks, which is now illegal to trade. You may have heard of the dodo bird, which was is now extinct because of human hunting. So actually going out and hunting and killing animals can lead to the extinction. But most of the time species become extinct not so much because humans are directly killing the animals or the plants, but for other reasons. Pesticide use. Pesticides are used to help in agriculture, to kill weeds and insects that might prey on crops. Well, pesticide use can have significant negative impacts on the environment and can lead to the extinction of species. One famous example of this is with bald eagles and other birds of prey. When the herbicide DDT was developed, it was used in very frequently, and it was used in great amounts, spread over entire fields and thousands of acre farms. And this DDT had the effect of killing insects, which allowed for growing crops easier, but the negative effect was that it also got into the food web, made its way from plants to insects and small animals and larger animals and so forth. And every time one organism consumes another, that toxin, DDT in this case, was being concentrated in the tissues of their body. In birds, what happened was these top carnivore birds like eagles and hawks, it caused the shells of their eggs to become thin. That was the effect of this built-up DDT. And the eggs never survived. They didn't hatch. And so the offspring of these birds of prey dropped very quickly, and they were in danger of becoming extinct. However, if the use of these sorts of chemicals can be limited, and that's what happened with DDT, it was banned for use, then species can make a comeback. And bald eagles are a great example of a species that has made a comeback, that they're no longer endangered because most areas stopped the use of DDT, and eventually the populations of bald eagles return. So there is hope that if we do address some of the issues of species extinction, then the problem can be improved. Another reason for species extinction is human land use. So as the number of humans on Earth increases, as I said, they require more resources, living space, food, etc. And so that requires humans to use more and more of the Earth's land to provide those resources. And that land use typically destroys the habitat of species that are living in the area. For example, the panda in China. There's less than 2,000 of these pandas remaining on Earth, and that's mainly due to the destruction of their habitat. If you imagine the tropical rainforest, an area of huge biodiversity, but tropical rainforests are also being destroyed for agriculture and other reasons. In the last 150 years, there's been a 50% reduction in the amount of tropical rainforest present on the Earth. Also, climate change. Climate change, as ecosystems change due to the warming Earth, that leads to species possibly becoming extinct because they're not adapted to the climatic conditions that are present after climate change takes place. And so what happens when species become extinct? Well, obviously, once a species is extinct, it's permanent. There's no coming back. There's no restoring a species once it's become extinct. That loss of biodiversity can affect the ecosystem. Think about when we've been talking about these keystone species and those trophic cascades. If one of those top carnivore species become extinct, we've now learned about how many far-reaching impacts there can be from the removal of just that single species. So how do we help prevent this? Well, we protect certain areas of habitat, okay, that we make it so that the habitat of endangered species is protected. We limit or outlaw the hunting of species. We limit development to areas where endangered species are not living. We control greenhouse gas emissions. There are ways that we can help to reduce this impact, but it takes significant change. And here you see some examples of species that are endangered. And so when we think of these, and lots of people talk about endangered species, we talk about these charismatic species, especially these large mammals that everyone's so concerned about, whether it's gorillas or the Asian elephants or Siberian tiger or the red wolf, so forth. But for each one of those species that we're sort of familiar with and that we see on posters, there are thousands of amphibians and plants and smaller mammals that don't get the attention but are still in danger, and the effects of losing those other organisms are just as pronounced. But people tend to focus on these large species. Another environmental issue that's important is this issue of invasive or exotic or introduced species. Because of human sort of global travel and people and goods traveling from one part of the world to another, there's been many organisms which have been brought from one ecosystem where they had evolved to a new ecosystem where they're not native, where they don't originally exist. Those are called non-native species. When that happens, often these newly introduced species, these invasive species, their populations can grow very quickly because they don't have natural predators often in that area. Okay? Because they've been brought there. The ecosystem has not evolved to provide predators for some of these organisms. So their population can grow very rapidly. They can disrupt the ecosystem. They can outcompete native species that are meant to be there. An example is if you go hiking in sort of wet, marshy areas, you may know what a cattail is. Cattails are a type of plant that grows out of very, very wet conditions and marshes. It's got a little brown fruit at the top of it. This is the native vegetation in these areas around where we live, and provides great habitat for ducks and turtles and things like that, provides food for certain species. However, there are some non-native species like purple loosestrife, a purple flowering plant, or Phragmites, a reed, which has been brought to the United States from Europe, and it has spread into these ecosystems, and it's outcompeting the native cattails. And the effects of that are that native species that relied on cattails are starting to die off as well. You know, sometimes these species are introduced on accident. For example, when a ship takes in water in one part of the world and then ships that cargo to another part of the world and releases that water, that ballast water, with that, non-native species can sort of hitch a ride. If you ever go boating and you trailer your boat from lake to lake, you'll see that at the boat launches there's signs about checking your boat to make sure you're not bringing plants or animals from one ecosystem to another. There's some really damaging invasive species in our area, things like zebra mussels or Eurasian milfoil is a plant. And these can spread from lake to lake on boats when people move their boat from lake to lake. Sometimes these species are even brought in on purpose. You guys did your ecology lab and you probably saw starlings. Starlings are non-native species. Starlings were brought to the United States from Europe, and the person that brought them, I believe the story is released, I think a dozen starlings in Central Park in New York City, because there were no starlings there and they wanted the birds that were mentioned by Shakespeare in Central Park. And so they were released. They now live all throughout the Northeast, all throughout the United States. And they've outcompeted native species that otherwise would have been living here. Rabbits, for example, in Australia, they were brought there purposely. 24 rabbits were released into the wild in Australia in 1859. There are now billions of rabbits living in Australia, and they've become a pest, a nuisance. They've damaged the ecosystem. This is kudzu. This is a plant. I believe it was native to Asia. And kudzu is this mat-like plant that grows over. It's found mostly in the southern parts of the United States. This is the winter, and you could see it's by early fall, this plant, these mats of vegetation have completely covered all of this ecosystem, all over the cabin in the woods and over all the plants, and obviously has negative effects. And one solution, sometimes you could use pesticides or to control some of these animals, but often those pesticides have their own environmental impacts. One way that scientists have of thinking about controlling these species and others is through what's called biocontrol, using predators to control these invasive species, to limit them. Here's some examples. These are zebra mussels. If you ever go up on a lake, you might have seen them. In our area, they're all over. They're small little mollusks. They came in the ballast water of ships coming across the oceans, and they clog intake pipes. They outcompete native mussels that should be living in our streams and our lakes and so forth. This is purple loosestrife. It's actually a pretty flower, and it was brought to the United States as a landscaping plant, but has escaped and has completely dominated some marshy areas. Many types of insects have been brought. The gypsy moth, which was introduced into the United States to help produce silk, but it actually doesn't produce silk and has made its way through forests, defoliating plants. Dutch elm disease is a disease that killed millions and millions of elm trees that used to be all throughout the United States. It's spread by a beetle. Phragmites is this reed that grows in these wet areas, also competing with cattails. Starlings, pigeons, rats, all of these are non-native invasive species. Water pollution. So pollution is the adding of any harmful substance to an ecosystem. And so when humans add a harmful substance to the water, we call that water pollution. It could include things like sewage from our septic systems, or pollutants like toxins, fertilizers, pesticides. When we use these products on the land, as we learned when we looked at the water cycle, they eventually make their way into our water, and that can have negative effects. Sometimes, as in DDT, these pollutants can affect organisms in the food web. The concentrations build up through biomagnification, damaging predators and killing predators. These toxins move through the food web as one organism eats another. Pollution such as fertilizers that get into the water can encourage the growth of algae and other types of plants that can cause there to be a drop in oxygen in the water. So there's various types of pollutions and that infiltrate the water, and to sort of help reduce this problem, we have to control the sources of this pollution. We have to treat wastewater before it's released into the ecosystem. We need to dispose of waste properly. We need to use pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers intelligently so that we're not adding excess to the ecosystem. And those are ways that water pollution can be improved. And one alternative, we're talking about pesticides, which are chemicals used to control pests like insects and so forth. There are also other means of controlling pests other than the using chemicals to kill them. And one of those ways is called biocontrol. Using biocontrols is basically using biology, okay, rather than chemicals to help get rid of pests. And typically these biocontrols interfere with some aspect of the pest's life. For example, you probably have seen these, maybe you have them in your backyard. These are Japanese beetle traps. Japanese beetles are an invasive beetle that defoliates plants. They actually are treated with a pheromone, a scent, that leads Japanese beetles to come in here, and they get trapped in the bag. Scientists sometimes introduce sterile males of an insect into the population. It mates with females. However, because it's sterile, they don't have any offspring, so it helps to limit the population. Bringing in special predators or diseases of an invasive species is sometimes done. When I used to do an activity when we raised these Coleoptera beetles and then brought them down to the Utica Marsh and released them to help control the population of purple loosestrife. There are these flies that decapitate ants, and sometimes they're introduced in an area to help control fire ants. Another environmental issue is acid precipitation or acid rain. And it's caused when sulfur or nitrogen from burning fossil fuels is released into the air. And that pollution combines with water and it forms an acid, sulfuric acid and nitric acid. And that acid that forms and falls to the earth in precipitation, it lowers the pH of ecosystems. It causes them to become more acidic. And many species cannot survive in acidic conditions, and so they die off. This is especially a problem in certain ecosystems. For example, the spruce forests of the Adirondacks, they are very sensitive to changes in pH. So as this acid precipitation falls in these ecosystems, it can rapidly destroy the forests. So how do we solve this problem? Well, we have to use less fossil fuels. We have to use cleaner fossil fuels that don't release as much sulfur and nitrogen. We can take the exhaust from cars or factories and treat it in a way to reduce the sulfur and nitrogen in it. These are all ways that we can sort of help to try to reduce this issue. Here we see where acid rain is more of a problem, and obviously when you look at this map of the United States, the orangish areas are areas with the most acid rain. And so you can see where we're living is sort of the heart of where acid rain is most harmful. And part of the reason is because in the United States, the prevailing winds blow from west to east. So pollution that's released in the air in the Midwest and these states in the middle part of the country, that pollution can be carried thousands of miles and then can land in New York State or other states, causing further acidification. This graph attempts to show, how lowering the pH because of acid rain affects different species. If a lake's normal pH is 6.5, all of these species can survive. But as the pH drops because of acid rain, things start to die off. For example, the mussel can't tolerate conditions that have a pH of 5.5. If you keep going down, you're losing more and more organisms until at a very low pH, only a couple types of insects can survive. There are lakes in the Adirondacks that are completely devoid of life. There's no living organisms in them because they have become so acidic over time. Ozone depletion is another important environmental issue. The ozone layer is a layer very, very high in the atmosphere that protects us from ultraviolet radiation. You know that the sun releases ultraviolet radiation, which is harmful and can have harmful effects on living things, living organisms. Ozone, this layer of our atmosphere, it's O3, it's just oxygen, it's not O2 but O3, blocks some of this ultraviolet radiation. So if you destroy the ozone layer, you allow more ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface of the Earth, and that leads to the destruction of plankton in the oceans, which form the base of the food chain. In humans, it can lead to cancer, eye cancer, and skin cancer, because that's what exposure to ultraviolet radiation does. And the reason the ozone layer is being depleted or broken down is because of a chemical called chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. These used to be very commonly used in aerosol cans and spray cans, like spray paint or hairspray, used in refrigerants and air conditioning units and so forth. But once scientists realized what effect these CFC chemicals were having on the ozone layer, they actually came together throughout the world, and countries agreed to what was called the Montreal Protocol, in which countries limited their use of CFCs. And I think that was in 1987. And once they did that, what you see is the problem of ozone depletion sort of moderated. You see, the minimum ozone is how much ozone there is. So again, we have, as time goes on, the amount of ozone in the atmosphere is decreasing, which was harmful. And then the Montreal Protocol comes into play, and it sort of stabilizes. And even today, we're seeing some repair of the ozone layer because humans have gotten together and agreed and limited our use of these CFCs. So when countries work together for the greater good, they can have an impact. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as we're thinking about these problems, because it can be pretty depressing. Then the final environmental issue that I'll talk about is climate change. In my view, climate change is the most dangerous and concerning of these issues. And so climate change is caused when humans add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It traps heat at the Earth's surface and causes the Earth's temperature to rise. So why are we increasing CO2 levels? Well, it comes from the burning of fossil fuels. When fossil fuels are extracted from the Earth and burned, they release carbon dioxide. And as you know, we are using vast amounts of these fossil fuels, gasoline in our cars and coal and natural gas in our stoves and in power plants. And so as we burn these resources, which we call hydrocarbons, they contain a lot of energy, but we can use that energy, but the result is the release of carbon dioxide. You can see here in this graph at the bottom, in the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have varied over the Earth's history. You can see it on this blue line on the graph. CO2 levels dropped at some points, rose, dropped, rose, etc. Sort of oscillating over time. And when carbon dioxide levels dropped, that's often when we had an ice age, because less carbon dioxide means the Earth is colder. More carbon dioxide means the Earth is warmer. However, when we look at the end of this graph, as we get to modern times, look at what's happened. Rather than the last 400,000 year cycle, okay, look at what has happened to carbon dioxide levels. We're now well up here, beyond what we've seen in the last 400,000 years. Huge increase in carbon dioxide, and subsequently an increase in the temperature of the Earth. This is because of something called the greenhouse effect. as we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, you can think of it as adding blankets onto your bed. You add one blanket and another and another. And the effect of those blankets is they trap your body heat in close to you. Same is true of greenhouse gases. As we increase the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the Earth gets warmer and warmer. Okay? And we'll talk about what some of those impacts are. And so this carbon dioxide, it traps the heat that normally would radiate out back into space, and it traps that heat close to the Earth's surface, heating it up. And predictions vary. Scientists use computer models to try to predict what's going to happen to the Earth's temperature. And when we look at the projections for the future, we predict an increase of 1.5 to 6.4 degrees Celsius by 2100. And 1.5 is very optimistic. If humans took drastic action now to limit our release of carbon dioxide, we could maybe limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but that's if we take serious action very quickly. If we do not do so, then the number is going to be higher. And that number can have very serious impacts on all different parts of the Earth. Here we see, just since the Industrial Revolution, we look at the average temperature of the Earth. Look at the red line. That's more accurate. It fluctuates certainly, but since 1900, look at what has happened to the average global temperature of the Earth. It has increased drastically. It continues to increase. Almost every single year, when scientists look at the average temperature for that year, it's the highest ever on record. And that predicted warming has some serious effects. Okay, there are different models that are used, like I said, to predict this. Okay, and you can see, several different lines. A model is just basically a computer model. This is what I did when I was in graduate school. I would write computer code to try to make predictions about how a change in one part of the ecosystem would affect another. And so these models of global warming, of climate change, they look at what the change in carbon dioxide is and then try to calculate what effects that's going to have. So what are the effects? Well, as the Earth gets warmer, anytime you heat a liquid, it expands. And so the oceans, as they become warmer, they expand. Also, as glaciers that are on land melt, that water from those melting glaciers ends up in the oceans. And so what we have is sea level rising. Okay, we've seen, again, since 1880, rise in sea level over time. We see a decrease in sea ice. If you look at this satellite imaging, this was in the 1950s. Okay, this is the Arctic. This is the ice cover. And then as we look where we are today, much less ice present. Okay, and again, that is leading to significant changes. Animals and plants that have adapted to living in these polar conditions, well, conditions are changing drastically for them, and often they cannot adapt quickly enough to survive those changes. Leads to flooding in coastal areas. Huge numbers of people live on coastal areas. Huge major cities are often located on the coast. Think of Miami or Boston or New York City. These are cities that are on the ocean, and as the ocean level rises, that's going to lead to flooding of these areas. As the oceans become warmer, that heat is the fuel for storms. So hurricanes, tropical storms, the energy for those storms comes from heat within the ocean. So if we increase the temperature of the ocean, we increase the intensity of those storms. Warm water also holds less oxygen, and therefore species that require high levels of oxygen cannot survive. And as I said, as these ecosystems change, as the climate changes, the species that were once adapted to one set of conditions those conditions change, the species may not be able to adapt. It shifts ecosystems northward, for example, changes migration patterns in organisms, the timing. Species have evolved. For example, birds have evolved to migrate based on time of the year so that they can have abundant food and find mates and so forth. Well, if that timing is no longer in sync with the actual seasons, it can lead to major problems for those migratory species. Forest fires increase. Okay, allergies increase because plants produce more pollen. There's a huge cascade of effects that happen as the temperature of the earth gets warmer. Okay, the ice in glaciers is half of what it once was. And the problem is there's positive feedback loop in terms of sea ice. So when there's plenty of ice, it's reflective. As the sun shines on, it reflects the energy back, okay, reducing the heat. But as the earth warms and this ice melts, okay, that darker ocean of that melted ice absorbs more of the heat energy, which causes it to get warmer, which causes more melting of the ice, which causes it to absorb more. So you have this sort of positive feedback loop, which can be very dangerous. Climate change doesn't just affect sort of ecosystems in a general way, it affects humans in very significant ways. And there's just a list. So agriculture. The agriculture is developed so that people grow certain crops in certain areas depending on the temperature and the amount of moisture. Well, as climate change takes hold, there will be more droughts. The growing season will change. The timing of when the growing season happens will change. Floods. There will be increased flooding. If you live in New Hartford, you may be aware that we have had huge flooding over the past several years. Okay, and part of the reason is we have more intense storms. Okay, and we don't have the infrastructure capable of handling that right now. Migration, as people's areas where they live become uninhabitable due to climate change, whether it's because of flooding or because it's just too hot or lack of food and water, then those people need to move to other areas. They become what we call climate refugees. They have to find an area that's hospitable to their living, and that leads to stress on societies. Okay? There's thought to be 150 million environmental refugees by the year 2050. Leads to a lack of drinking water, more droughts because there's less water in the snowpack because there's less snow. There's increased pollen, allergies, asthma, more frequent heat waves. So there are a whole host of negative consequences of this climate change. Okay, glacier is melting. So it's kind of depressing, I know. But we have to hold some hope that we can have an impact on the problems that we just talked about. So what are the things that humans can do to try to improve environmental issues? We can educate people about what population growth is doing to our planet. We can begin by using resources more wisely, reducing the amount of resources we use, recycling materials whenever possible. These things can allow us to conserve the natural resources for as long as possible. Trying to control pollution, taxing pollution like carbon dioxide, can help to reduce the use of fossil fuels. Okay, as if we were to tax carbon dioxide at a higher rate, it would make gasoline and coal more expensive and would drive the use of more renewable resources. Making laws to preserve species, to reduce development in areas where species are endangered. Legislation, laws by governments can have an impact as well. Okay, we've used laws to protect our drinking water, to protect our air, preservation of our wetlands, and these laws can have a significant impact. Okay? But it takes administrations that are willing to set these limits and enforce these limits. And unfortunately, different administrations don't have those priorities. Our current administration has drastically reduced the enforcement and the regulations around environmental policy. Also, global cooperation is important because most of these problems are not just isolated to one single country. Climate change is a problem for the entire world, and all countries are contributing to it. So we need agreements between countries to limit fossil fuel use, limit carbon dioxide production, etc. And there have been attempts at this. The Kyoto Protocol was one of the first, and then the Montreal Protocol. The Paris Accord is an important one. That's one of the most recent agreements between countries throughout the world to help try to limit the effects of climate change, help limit the production of carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, in this administration, the U.S. has pulled out of is in the process of pulling out of the Paris Accord to help limit carbon dioxide production. And also in how we plan, how we use our land, how we use resources. We need thoughtful planning, thoughtful public to sort of ask questions about these things, to be concerned about the environment when making decisions, by looking at what the true costs are of development, what are the trade-offs between different types of development to allow us to make informed decisions and help improve upon environmental issues in our planet. And that's going to start with young people, okay? That I believe that young people are more aware of many of these environmental problems, and as you start to become involved and help make decisions, that I believe that young people will make better decisions than my generation or the generation before me. And so our hope to control some of these problems is with you. So I hope that you do your part. And that's the end of our environmental problem notes. I know this was a lot. There's a lot of information here. If you're interested in these topics, I could recommend other resources for you or readings. When you go to high school, you might take AP Environmental Science or ecology courses that focus on many of these issues. So let me know if you're interested, if you want any recommendations, and I'd love to talk to you about it. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you later.